Story 1.
Before I consigned this mysterious and yet terrifying story to my archives, I swore to myself that no one would ever know what happened to me during those dark autumn days when the sun barely warmed the earth and the swift gusts of wind carried a bone-chilling cold from the sea. Much time has passed since then, and one day, as I was rummaging through my files, an old manuscript with yellowed pages filled with small, sprawling letters caught my eye. Recognizing my youthful handwriting, I pulled out the pages, settled into a chair, and began to read. And then the memories flooded back. I remembered my vow, remembered how I had tried to hide these pages as far away as possible so they would not cross my path again. But since then, I have witnessed things so dreadful that what is written below now seems to me nothing more than a youthful adventure to test my nerves. Therefore, without false modesty, I decided to include it in the collection I am preparing for the press, especially since the truly horrific things are still kept in my office, locked away in a safe. In the north of England, near the foothills of the massive Scottish mountain ranges, on the plains of a county called Oxfordshire, south of Beverley, strictly between Hatfield and Scunthorpe, lies the small village of Crowell. This place, seemingly unremarkable at first glance, bore all the brightest features of provincial life in Old England at the turn of the century. Low, mostly one, and occasionally two-story houses, a post office, a butcher's shop, a church on the main street, and a marvel of the coming century, a general store selling a wide range of goods, influenced by the proximity of larger cities. As for inns, there were only two in the village, both small, so travelers often preferred to stop at the inn a mile and a half outside of town. The innkeepers were the most charming people one could ever meet. Elderly Meister Wilbert Garing, a former soldier of Her Majesty's army, who had returned to his native land in his twilight years to take over his late father's estate, and Mrs. Amenia Garing, née Hawking, the daughter of a baker from a neighboring village, whom her parents believed had made an exceptionally good match. What hospitality these hosts possessed! Under their roof, a weary traveler could find everything they desired. Fresh horses, a hot meal, as well as kind words and a few words of advice for the road. The locals knew this and greatly admired the harmonious couple. However, a few years ago, everything suddenly changed. Many travelers began avoiding the local roads and made efforts to bypass the inn. The locals also disappeared, and now everything within a mile of the Garing's house was deserted, with only wild animals occasionally disturbing the area. Yet, this did not stop the occasional passerby from traveling along the now abandoned road, and so it happened that one day, I found myself as that passerby. It was late September, a time not too cold, but up here in the north, one had to wear a warm coat. It had been just over 2 months since the incident with the young man possessed by some unknown force, who had found refuge in an ancient medallion. During all this time, at my patron's insistence, I had spent my leave visiting friends in Scunthorpe. But now, it was time to return to London. I left the town in the morning, hoping to reach Hatfield by evening, spend the night there, and then head to the capital the next day via the new country highway. However, my plans were not destined to succeed. Having passed Kedby, a small village on the banks of a fast-flowing local river, I ventured into the wilderness. The farther north I went, the wilder and more deserted the ancient roads became, laid here probably during the times of the Roman Caesars. However, in recent times, the government had taken a number of measures, and a long network of highways now spanned this mountainous region, connecting Scotland with the capital of the empire. Yet, few people still lived here. The next few hours, my carriage rattled along the uneven road, surrounded on both sides by tall trees. The sunlight barely penetrated through the thick canopy of leaves, and so a gloomy twilight reigned on the road. But finally, the continuous rows of trees were replaced by a clearing, which, though clearly abandoned, still brought some relief. And then by a plain with evenly spaced stumps protruding from the ground. It was clear that the battle against the impenetrable wilderness had not ceased here. However, it was strange. Wherever I looked, there was no sign of life. A couple of houses stood lonely among the fields, but a single glance was enough to understand that they had long been abandoned. The road became wider and better maintained, indicating that someone still took care of it. Untilled and unsown fields stretched on both sides to the horizon, and I couldn't help but wonder what had made people abandon this fertile land, as all signs indicated that someone once lived here. As I pondered this, I didn't even notice how the carriage began to slow down, and it wasn't until we stopped at the gates of the inn, and the coachman, a broad-shouldered tall fellow named Randall, turned to explain that he needed to change the horses and check what had happened to the wheel, that I awoke from my deep trance. The place where we stopped hardly resembled a bustling roadside station like those found every 2 miles on the country highways. It was unlikely that anyone stopped here more than once every few weeks or even months. However, despite the overall picture of neglect, the house and the outbuildings attached to it looked well maintained and tidy, and from the backyard came the familiar cacophony to the ears of any rural dweller: the clucking of chickens, the grunting of pigs, the loud neighing of horses echoing across the area. At the front door stood a short, gray-haired man who watched me intently as I descended from the carriage. "Can I be of any assistance to you?" he asked after all the norms of courtesy had been observed. "My name is Prescott. I'm passing through here, and it seems my carriage has broken down a bit. The roads here are challenging. Do you mind if we stay with you for the day to make some repairs and then continue our journey?" "You may stay as long as you like, sir. The Garing's Inn is at your service. My name is Wilbert. My wife is Amelia. Allow me to show you to your room." With these words, he gestured for me to follow, turned, and headed toward the entrance. The matter of payment was settled quickly and without unnecessary questions. The couple showed remarkable flexibility and even agreed to charge me only half the 2-day rate for the room. Within 2 hours, Meister Garing and I were sitting in the spacious parlor of the house in front of a brightly blazing fireplace, watching the logs crackling softly, brought into the house by their servant Tyler, and entertained each other with conversation. The owner of the house turned out to be an extraordinary person. As I learned, he had served in the far reaches of Africa, in one of Britain's southernmost colonies, where he had spent several years observing the lives of the locals, filled with things that would seem so wild to us that we wouldn't even think about them. In turn, I shared with him a couple of stories from my not-too-rich reporting experience, naturally omitting the recent incident with the student from Ur, rightly fearing to share it with anyone. "Your stories are remarkable, Mr. Prescott. God knows, it's not every day in these troubled times that one can meet such a perceptive and capable young man." "Oh, come now," I replied with a tongue that refused to obey, trying my best not to show signs of embarrassment. "I'm not the only one. There are dozens of people in our office far more talented than I am." "Trust my experience, young man." Mr. Garing looked at me over his glasses. "You have a bright future ahead of you. I strongly urge you to sit down and write a book." "Oh no, sir. Don't embarrass me. My writing abilities hardly measure up even to Mr. McGonagall's level." Upon hearing the name of the most untalented poet in history, my companion smiled. At that very moment, Mrs. Garing appeared in the parlor and announced that dinner was ready. We got up and hastened to take our places at the table. Dinner was plentiful but simple, in the provincial style. Nothing excessive, which immediately indicated that the people living here were not accustomed to spending their modest earnings frivolously. After thanking the host, I went upstairs and walked through the narrow corridor, where a pleasant twilight reigned, to the door of my room. Besides me, according to the hosts, there was an elderly retired cavalry officer, Mr. Herbert Larson, staying on the second floor, occupying the corner room at the top of the stairs. Randall was given a small room on the first floor. Pushing the door open, I entered the room. The interior was not particularly rich, but the pleasant atmosphere of warmth and coziness more than compensated for the modesty of the surroundings. A small curtained window, a narrow wooden wardrobe with carved handles, a small table. All of this brought a smile to my face. Therefore, the large oak bed, occupying a good half of the room, looked out of place and somewhat alien. Undressing and hanging my clothes in the wardrobe, I lay down on the bed, covered myself with a warm woolen blanket, mentally calculating how long it would take me to fall asleep, and, closing my eyes, immediately fell into a deep sleep. I woke up at dawn and lay under the blanket for a long time, unwilling to get up. The morning was cold, a sign of the approaching capricious late autumn. Finally realizing that I needed to personally check on the progress of the carriage repairs, I reluctantly forced myself to get up, dress, and, after completing my usual morning routines, went downstairs. Looking out of the parlor window, I was surprised to find that my transport was still in the same place where it had stopped the previous evening, and from its appearance, it didn't seem as though anyone had tried to repair it. Puzzled, I went outside to find Randall, but to my greater surprise, he was nowhere to be found. "Mr. Garing," I asked the elderly host after observing all the usual norms of courtesy, "do you know where my coachman has gone?" "Of course I know," he replied with a smile. "The young man asked me to tell you that he couldn't handle the repair on his own, so he saddled one of your horses and rode to Crowell for help. You can check in the stable if you don't believe my words." However, I preferred to take his word for it. Such trust did this man inspire in me. At that moment, Mrs. Garing entered and announced that breakfast was ready. After an hour spent in pleasant conversation and enjoying an incredibly delicious meal, I decided to take a short walk. Returning to my room, I put on a light walking coat and hat, took my favorite sturdy walking stick from the wardrobe, and exited through the back door into the yard, bidding the hosts farewell. Passing through the yard and finding myself beyond the low stone fence that separated the Garings' property from the rest of the world, I couldn't help but marvel at the vastness and openness of this northern wasteland. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, there were no trees, just gentle hills or completely flat fields covered with low grass and occasional shrubs. Low trees grew only along the road, creating the feeling of a wall separating the dusty road from the rest of the world. In the distance, about a mile from the house, I saw a strange black line. I squinted but couldn't make out what it was. Curiosity got the better of me, and I headed toward this mysterious sight. What could it be? This question kept running through my mind, while the black wall inexorably approached. Finally, it loomed before me. It turned out to be a continuous ridge of black stones, roughly piled on top of each other. It was about 3 yards high, and it gave the impression that these stones had appeared here relatively recently. I slowly reached out and touched one of them. A chill ran through my fingertips. The entire ridge was crisscrossed with narrow slits, one of which was right at shoulder level. I cautiously bent down, peering inside, hoping to see a stone wall, but found nothing. The slit extended further and disappeared into the darkness. And once again, curiosity took hold of me, and I was about to look closer when I suddenly recoiled. It seemed to me that I had seen a faint glint of someone's eyes in that impenetrable darkness. It lasted only a moment, but for some reason I remembered that I didn't see a black pupil in the white of the eye. Or perhaps there wasn't one at all. In any case, the desire to stand here and ponder this structure vanished instantly, so I turned and almost ran back. With every step, this strange place receded further from me, but the unsettling feeling that I was being watched settled inside and stubbornly refused to leave. The first thing I did when I got back to the house was go straight to the parlor, where I found Mr. Garing sitting by the fire as if nothing had happened. When I asked him if he knew anything about the Blackstone Ridge a mile from his house, he said he didn't. But I thought I saw a flicker of blind fury mixed with fear cross his face for a brief moment. That evening, Randall did not return, despite all the assurances of the host that it was just a short distance to Crowell from his house, and even shorter on horseback. I became so anxious that I spent nearly an hour standing at the parlor windows, staring down the straight road leading west, expecting every moment to see a familiar silhouette appear on it. But that didn't happen. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Garing called everyone to dinner, and I reluctantly abandoned my post. Even though nothing out of the ordinary had seemingly happened, the atmosphere at the table was tense. The hosts silently attended to their portions, leaving me to my own thoughts. I was deeply lost in thought. There was definitely some connection between this seemingly prosperous family and whatever resides a mile from here among the black stones. Or else I wouldn't have caught such a look from the head of the house. But what could it be? And then I remembered. "Mr. Garing, will Mr. Larson be joining us for dinner?" I asked, with the most innocent expression I could muster. But I didn't expect the reaction this question would provoke. The hosts exchanged glances and looked at me. In their eyes, I saw blind fear and anxiety. Thankfully, not anger, I thought secretly. "Mr. Larson is not in the best of spirits, so Mrs. Garing takes his meals directly to his room," Mr. Garing replied, trying to keep his voice casual. I nodded, but the feeling of distrust did not leave me for a second. After dinner, I decided to take a walk along the road toward Crowell. I had no desire to wander through the grassy wasteland again. There was still about an hour left before sunset, and I was anxious to meet my coachman, so I put on my coat, grabbed my cane, and set out. The evening was cold and windy, as autumn evenings often are, with the crimson sunset frequently vanishing behind slow-moving, heavy clouds, which seemed laden with lead. I walked on, shielding myself from the howling wind with my collar. The landscape around me appeared deserted and abandoned. Rare signs of human habitation, crooked wooden houses and fields overgrown with dense vegetation, had almost entirely blended into the scenery, with nature rapidly reclaiming its domain. Ahead, the road abruptly ended, and within minutes, I found myself on the slope of a small hill. I could see all the surroundings for a good 2 miles ahead, and I quickly scanned the vast expanse for landmarks indicating the nearest settlement. I didn't have to search long. The village of Crowell was about a mile from me, with the setting sun casting its rays generously on the windows facing it. From this distance, it was too far to make out the residence, but upon closer inspection, I managed to spot barely discernible black dots moving along the road from the village toward a broad black stripe far ahead. This was the new country highway that had been laid here relatively recently to better connect the sparsely populated north of the country with the densely populated south. If one set out in the morning with a decent carriage, the journey would take no more than an hour and a half. Unfortunately, I had neither, so all I could do was take a deep breath and, squinting again, search the road for any sign of Randall coming my way. I gazed for a long time into the green distance and the darkening strip of road, straining to catch even the slightest hint of my coachman's shadow. but I found nothing. This both worried and angered me greatly. Why on earth had Mr. Garing assured me that Randall would return by 4 o'clock when there was no sign of him even now, at 7:30? Moreover, I needed to hurry, as I was expected to be in London in 2 days to receive the work plan for the coming month from my patron. I would likely have stood there lost in thought if I hadn't suddenly realized that it was starting to get dark. Deciding to question the hosts in more detail upon my return, I turned and quickly walked back toward the house. The sun was sinking lower, and dark blue clouds were gathering on the horizon. 10 minutes later, I was almost back. I was just a few steps away from the turn onto the small path leading to the yard when suddenly a loud scream rang out from the direction of the house, instantly freezing me in place. I stood as if paralyzed, unable to move a step. There was no doubt the scream had come from the Garings' house. Then it stopped as abruptly as it had started. A dead silence fell, but even in that silence I found no peace. I felt my entire body, from the roots of my hair to the tips of my fingers, fill with a cold wave of primal fear, and my vision grew darker with each passing second. With my last ounce of strength, I mustered all my willpower and forced my mind to return to the real world, pulling myself out of the nightmarish abyss, and listened intently. Somewhere at the edge of my hearing, I managed to discern the faint sound of footsteps. In an instant, the ability to move returned to me, and fear shrank to the periphery of my consciousness. Realizing that here, hidden from view by the trees, I was relatively safe, curiosity began to take hold more urgently. Noticing that the thicket right in front of me was not too dense, I cautiously, trying not to make a sound, squeezed through the branches. Every small snap of a twig echoed in my head like a noisy cannonade, as if 1,000 cannons were lined up in a row, firing into the sky. Finally, I managed to part the branches enough to observe what was happening in the yard while remaining unnoticed. Before me stood the 2-story Garing house, with one of the second-floor windows wide open. For a moment, I felt a chill inside, but then I remembered that it wasn't my room and felt slightly reassured. A man stood directly under the window. His face was not visible. He was facing away from me, but I noticed his tall, nearly 1.5-yard figure, broad shoulders, and a head covered with thick hair, and to my surprise, I recognized him as Tyler, Mr. Garing's servant. He was dressed entirely in black and kept glancing around nervously, clearly afraid of being seen. At that moment, a dark figure appeared in the window, and a second later, I recognized Mr. Garing. He paused for a moment, surveying the surroundings, then, seemingly satisfied that no one was watching, disappeared into the darkness of the room. I froze, staring intently at the window. Half a minute later, he reappeared in the frame, looked down, gave a quick nod, and at that moment, some heavy black object flew out of the window. After a few seconds of flight, it landed squarely in the hands of the man below. He caught the load with one hand, shook it, and as if disregarding its weight, hefted it onto his shoulder. And then, to my horror, I realized what the load was. Tyler took one last look at the window, nodded to Mr. Garing, who was still standing in the frame, and then turned and carried the lifeless body somewhere behind the house. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, I cautiously, trying not to make a sound, emerged from the thicket and found myself back on the road, now bathed in the crimson light of the setting sun. I remembered whose room that was. According to the hosts, it was the one occupied by Mr. Larson, and there was no doubt that it was his body being carried away by the unknown figure. The only question was, where and why? After witnessing all this, I had absolutely no desire to return to that house, but common sense told me that for now I was relatively safe, and overcoming my inner resistance, I stepped onto the path leading to the yard. The door was opened by Mr. Garing himself. Though he made every effort to appear relaxed, he couldn't hide the fact that his eyes betrayed him. They were filled with unmistakable anxiety. I decided not to give him any reason for suspicion. "Lovely evening, sir, don't you think?" It seemed as though a great invisible weight had lifted from the host's shoulders. Yes, a lovely evening," he replied in a quiet voice, making a small pause between each word. "I think I'll head to bed now before I fall asleep right here." I interrupted the awkward silence with a forced smile. I wondered if Mr. Garing noticed the slight falsehood. As I climbed the stairs, I saw no changes. The corridor, shrouded in twilight, was still deserted. The door to Mr. Larson's room was locked, and only a barely discernible boot print near the door indicated that someone had entered the room not too long ago. Locking the door behind me, I walked to the window and drew the curtains, leaving, however, a small slit to safely observe what was happening outside. Silently sliding a chair over to the window, I sat down and prepared to wait. Outside, the last rays of the sunset played over the green wasteland. The black stripe half a mile from the house now appeared from here as just a shadow of some strangely shaped cloud. Surprisingly, I hadn't noticed it on the first day, I thought. Thus, I sat in contemplation for about half an hour. The sun had fully set, and darkness had completely taken over. Now I could safely open the curtains, but a sense of foreboding kept me seated and still, and as it turned out, not without reason. The clock faintly struck midnight. The darkness outside was so deep that if my eyes hadn't adjusted to it, the chance of seeing anything would have been slim. But, to my good fortune, my eyes, now accustomed to the pitch blackness, stubbornly peered into the night, until I finally made out two dark figures moving swiftly toward the outer fence of the backyard. I froze, deep inside suddenly losing confidence in my absolute invisibility to any onlooker, and unable to move, watched the figures in the darkness with only my eyes. Suddenly, they stopped, and it seemed as though their gazes were directed straight at me. It felt like an eternity before the figures started moving again toward the gate. And then I heard footsteps, barely audible footsteps on the stairs. Someone trying to step as quietly as possible, apparently fearing to wake a sleeping guest, was slowly climbing to the second floor. A chill ran through me, and for a moment I feared that my door was wide open. But a quick glance reassured me. It was locked tight. In the next second, heavy footsteps could be heard in the corridor. It took me only a moment to leap silently onto the bed and pull the blanket over my head. At my door, I heard a strange sound, like a faint scratching, and then a second later, I heard something being inserted into the keyhole from the other side. Damn it, the key is on the table, I thought. For a moment, a wild thought crossed my mind to jump up, grab the key, and lock it in the door to prevent the person on the other side from opening it. The thought flashed and then disappeared. Just in time, as at that very moment there was a faint click, and I heard the handle of the door move slightly. Someone had silently entered the room and was slowly approaching the bed. At that moment, I felt cold sweat running down my back, and I tried my hardest to appear as innocent as possible, even attempting to mimic the steady breathing of a sleeper. But it seemed to me that my pounding heart was giving me away. The footsteps stopped right beside my bed, and through the narrow gap in the blanket, I could only see a vague silhouette against the dark wall. And then, as if something clicked in my mind, a surge of energy spread warmth through my body. In a swift motion, I swung and struck the figure standing beside me, hitting it directly in the groin. The person let out a muffled grunt, doubling over at the waist. In a second, I was on my feet, grabbing the cane that had been lying neatly beside the chair. At that moment, the moonlight fell on the face of the intruder, and I saw that it was Tyler. Stunned, I stared at him. He, however, wasted no time. Straightening up, he lunged at me, pulling back his right hand, in which he held a small hatchet, likely intending to split my skull with it just moments ago. Barely dodging the blow, I swung again and skillfully struck my assailant's legs with the cane. I should mention that it was quite unusual. The handle was made of heavy metal and the shaft was cast in lead. It had been custom-made for me, paid for with the generous bonus I had received from my patron after the incident with the student from Ur. And as I had thought at the time, it was meant to help me in some sort of emergency. This situation was undoubtedly an emergency. The blow made Tyler stagger and crash into the wall on the opposite side of the room. However, he immediately turned, raised the hatchet above his head, and with a wild scream charged at me again. I reacted instantly. Ducking to avoid a stray blow, I swung with all my might and struck him in the ribs. A dull crack was heard, and Tyler screamed. Wasting no time, I repositioned the cane and delivered another blow, which proved fatal for the attacker. For a moment I stood staring at the lifeless body, blood streaming from the crushed skull. Then I turned and quickly exited the room. In a few swift leaps, I was downstairs, and the first thing I did was rush to the front door. Grabbing the handle, I yanked it toward me with a sharp motion. However, the heavy wood did not budge. Thinking the door was bolted, I tried to feel for the latch in the dim light, but was surprised to find it hadn't been slid into place. This could only mean that the door was locked. Remembering that Mr. Garing usually kept the keys in the kitchen, I turned and, trying to step as quietly as possible, headed toward the door leading to the parlor. Passing through it, I found myself in the cramped kitchen. I entered, stretching out my hands, expecting it to be illuminated only by the pale light of the autumn moon at this late hour. But to my astonishment, I found something entirely unexpected when I entered the room. Bright, pearly white light was streaming through the narrow kitchen window, set high under the eaves. Not finding the keys in their usual place, awkwardly nailed to the wall on a rusty hook, I suddenly remembered the existence of a second exit from the house, the door leading to the backyard. It was slightly ajar, and a strip of bright light shone through the narrow gap. Gripping the handle, I cautiously opened the door, stepped outside, and stunned by what I saw, stood frozen for several minutes, unable to move. The entire backyard of the Garing's house was bathed in the same bright white light I had noticed when I was in the kitchen. All the domestic animals, obviously disturbed by this strange new phenomenon, were on their feet. However, they weren't making a racket, trying to outdo each other's cries, but instead had silently huddled in the far corners of the yard, trembling quietly in fear. For a moment, I closed my eyes, unable to bear the light. It seemed as though my eyes were about to burst like overinflated balloons. But gradually, they adjusted, and I was finally able to lower my hand from my face and look around. The glow seemed to cover the entire sky, and only by straining my vision could I make out that it was coming directly from that strange stone ridge I had unsuccessfully tried to investigate the previous day. Common sense told me to flee this dreadful place as quickly as possible, but at the same time, I felt a treacherous curiosity beginning to take hold of me once again, forcing the blind fear to retreat. Repositioning my cane so that I could defend myself in case of a sudden attack, I moved toward the black ridge. I walked quickly, carefully avoiding the protrusions and yawning black rabbit holes. The pale glow, fortunately, made them visible. Pausing to catch my breath for a few seconds, I suddenly realized that here, in the open, I was more exposed than ever to any observer. This unsettling thought spurred me to move even faster. With each step, I counted a second in my head, and when I reached the first outcrop, I had just counted to 120. Tyler, is that you?" A voice suddenly called out from somewhere among the stones. I froze in place. "Damn it, Tyler, is that you? Answer me. Did you get him? Is the body with you? Don't be silent. There are only 2 minutes left until awakening. Tyler?" In the dark gap formed between two stones, Mr. Garing appeared. His face was pale, distorted by a grimace of panicked fear, with beads of sweat slowly trickling down his forehead. He was holding a large knife. I had never seen a knife of such a strange shape before. It was curved almost at the base and ended in a sharp serrated blade. It was about half the size of its owner's arm, and its shape resembled a village sickle more than anything else. "You?" Mr. Garing stared at me in shock. "What are you doing here? You should be dead. You were supposed to be brought. Your heart should be on the altar right now, or else." Suddenly, he fell silent, and then, with a furious scream, he lunged at me, raising the knife above his head. However, he lacked the speed, and when he was only a half step away from me, I reacted instantly, sending him to the ground with a blow from my heavy cane to his chest. But then, something unexpected happened. As he fell, Meister Garing apparently gripped the knife, and as he landed on the ground, the blood-stained blade emerged neatly from the other side. Coming to my senses, I quickly looked around and found myself standing frozen over the body of my opponent, who had been brought down by his own clumsiness. His blood flowed in streams across the ground, already forming a sizable puddle, from which a barely perceptible steam was slowly rising. Using the cane, I flipped the body onto its back. The corpse's eyes were wide open, a grimace of insane obsession frozen on its face. It seemed that until the very last moment, Meister Garing had hoped to kill his victim. I don't know how long I stood over the lifeless body when suddenly, from the dark gap, a woman's scream echoed. Barely aware of myself, I sharply pulled the bloody knife from Mr. Garing's chest and dashed into the gap. Inside the narrow passage that opened up before me, impenetrable darkness reigned, with only a faint light flickering far ahead. Under the heavy stone arches, the omnipresent echo carried every sound, even the faintest, in all directions. Without stopping, I ran forward, accompanied by desperate screams. With each passing second, they grew louder, and finally, I found myself in a lit space. It was a small grotto, illuminated by a single kerosene lamp, standing alone on a small stone ledge in the corner. But this light was more than enough. Upon entering the grotto, the first thing I noticed was Mrs. Garing, cowering in the corner and screaming at the top of her lungs. Following her gaze, I felt fear once again washing over me with its cold breath. In the very center of the grotto, two massive black stalagmites and the stalactites hanging above them intertwined to form a tall, wide gap, shaped almost like a perfect rhombus. The entire gap was filled with white light, but it was not as bright as on the surface. Rather, it was dull and seemed like a time-worn sheet. Opposite the gap stood a wide black stone, on which rested a large carved stone dish. It was empty now, but Mr. Garing's words about the heart that should have been on the altar immediately came to mind. There it was, the black altar, the altar for sacrifices, and this time, the victim was supposed to be me. My legs felt as if they were nailed to the floor as I watched something inhuman slowly seep through the dull mist between the two intertwined stones. a dangerous, terrifying beast. More precisely, it only partially resembled a beast. Long, powerful limbs ended in sharp claws, from which dark blood dripped. The massive body, covered in silver fur, was supported by strong, muscular legs. Sharp claws, like blades, gleamed in the bright light of the kerosene lamp. The large head might have resembled a wolf's if it didn't also have features vaguely reminiscent of both a dog and a human. The jaw, barely covered in fur, had 2 rows of large, sharp teeth. But where the eyes should have been, there were 2 black voids. The werewolf was eyeless and relied solely on its hearing. My assumption was immediately confirmed. Finding nothing on the stone dish, the creature knocked it off the stone with a single swipe of its clawed paw and slowly began to move toward Mrs. Garing, who had been screaming all this time. Reaching the woman, it grabbed her by the shoulders and lifted her off the ground with all its might. Massive jaws parted, and in that same instant, the desperate scream ceased. The mangled body of Mrs. Garing fell to the stone floor with a thud. Straightening up, the monster slowly began to turn toward me, growling deeply. I froze, trying not to breathe, but apparently, my heart was beating too loudly out of fear as a moment later, the werewolf was advancing on me, extending its clawed paws. There was nowhere to retreat. The sloping wall of the grotto loomed behind me. So when the monster, with a powerful lunge, rushed at me, I immediately jerked sharply and moved to the left. The creature's claws touched the cold stone, letting out a wild roar that made my hair stand on end. The monster turned and moved toward me again. Allowing myself to be cornered against the wall, I waited for the right moment. Another lunge, and once again, I narrowly escaped death. But this time, managing to circle the creature from the side, I drove the bloody knife into its back with all my might. Howling in pain, the monster turned and swung its paw with all its strength. This time, I didn't escape unscathed. The edge of its claws managed to leave a few scratches on my shoulder. Straightening up, I brought my cane into action. However, the first swing was unsuccessful. The werewolf managed to block my blow. The second time, I overcame both its arms and struck with all my might directly into its massive jaws. The creature recoiled, momentarily losing control of its body, which I quickly took advantage of. Aiming for its throat, I swung the knife, but the now recovered monster managed to intercept with its paw, causing the sharp blade to slice off one of its fingers. This only enraged it further, and in its next lunge, I wasn't so lucky. I was thrown to the ground with a swift movement, and the beast, jaws wide open, was ready to sink its sharp teeth into my head. But at the last moment, I managed to raise the cane between its jaws, and its fangs bit into the cold lead. There was a sickening crunch, followed by loud screeches that turned into a roar. The creature had broken several of its front teeth against the cane. Without hesitating, I grabbed the knife lying nearby and started slashing wildly at the beast looming over me. I didn't aim. I just kept stabbing, feeling the blade sink into the monster's flesh again and again. Black blood gushed from the gashes, streaming down in thick rivulets. The werewolf let out another wild roar, this time the last, and then it suddenly let out a piercing scream. There was nothing human in that scream, but it reminded me somehow of the dying wail of Mrs. Garing in her final moments. The creature continued to whimper, and I suddenly felt a strange sensation ripple through my body. In that same instant, my vision began to darken, and summoning all my remaining strength, I drove the dagger straight into the beast's heart, plunging it up to the hilt. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a dull thud and a wave of inhuman pain washing over me. The sun shone so brightly that even tightly shut eyes couldn't block out the light. The distant hum of insects was the only sound that echoed in my mind. Every breath was labored, and I could feel my heart pounding rapidly as though I could hear it through my clothes. I didn't want to get up. The crushing pain that had tormented me throughout my sleep was slowly fading. Vague images of the past night crawled through my mind. There was the beast, thrashing in its death throes, and I, without any pity, delivering the final blow with my knife. I snapped my eyes open. Bright sunlight, blue sky. But I had been in a grotto. I remembered that clearly. How had I ended up here? There was no one else alive around me. In the underground chamber, I had caught a glimpse of the half-eaten corpses of my former coachman and the retired cavalry officer. The monster had apparently gorged itself on their flesh. Both Garings were dead, and so was their servant and accomplice. But how did I get here, damn it? Rolling onto my stomach, I extended my arms and slowly pushed myself up. Before me loomed the black stone ridge. A little further off lay the now cold body of Mr. Garing, which had cooled overnight. But where was the entrance to the cave? I scanned the ridge. No wide crevices, just small gaps between the stones. Stretching, I rose to my knees, braced myself again, and finally stood up to my full height. The ridge stood before me like a silent giant, paying no attention to me. I looked around. Aside from the body of the house's owner, there was nothing left to remind me of the events of the previous night. Glancing around, I suddenly remembered what I had seen here the day before. Someone's eyes flashing in the darkness. This time, curiosity didn't argue or negotiate. It seemed as though my entire body recoiled at the idea of staying here any longer. With quick steps, I headed back to the house. To hell with personal belongings. I hadn't brought much with me anyway, and anything I needed could be bought in any town. Now straight to the stable, harness the horse, hit the road, and gallop fast, without looking back, leaving behind the dilapidated Garing's house standing by the edge of a deserted country road that crossed an endless wasteland, among the hills of which, by the mad whim of some unknown force, had arisen the tall black stone ridge, within whose depths lay the gateway to another world, a world of fear and horror, a world that harbored the evil that humanity had fled from throughout its existence, a world populated by unknown monstrous creatures, a world whose path would forever be guarded by the sinister black altar buried under layers of stone and earth.
Story 2.
Oh my God, they're close. I need to hide, but where? Where can I find escape from them? I can hear them breaking down the doors. How many of them are there? I don't know. Lord, save me. I'm scared. Oh no, they broke down the iron shutters. They're already inside. I can hear them coming toward me. I hear their heavy footsteps and their breathing. What do I do? How do I escape? How did this happen? How could I be in this situation? I know it's my own fault for being in this situation. I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have opened that damn envelope. It all started about a month ago. Picture a small, cluttered apartment in the heart of London. Shelves lined with unopened bills, tax documents, coffee-stained papers that had never found their way into a recycling bin. A laptop, overworked and overheating, groaned on the wobbly IKEA table that barely managed to fit into the congested space. This was my universe, my hermit kingdom. I'm Harry, a 28-year-old work-from-home office drone. You see, I'm a natural introvert. An endearing term my mom used was loner. Not married. No girlfriend, hell, not even a pet for company. The kind of guy whose coworkers vaguely recognize in Zoom meetings, but can't quite place in a physical office setting because I've hardly ever been there. My life wasn't exactly a thriller. Far from it. It was dominated by a vicious cycle of sleep, work, eat, and repeat, an existence that was undeniably mundane and yet comfortably predictable, a stark contrast to the terror I now find myself in. One dreary evening, while I was parsing through the relentless waves of junk mail and past due bills, my eyes fell upon a strange burgundy-colored envelope. It was a peculiar anachronism in this age of emails and instant messaging. It was from a law firm in Ireland, which was odd since I had no connections, as far as I knew, with the Emerald Isle. With a sense of intrigue, I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter, the weight of its words amplified by the seriousness of the font. It declared that a certain Meister Archibald Wolfe had recently passed away and had bequeathed me, his only living relative, his sprawling mansion and estate up in Ireland. Archibald Wolfe. The name struck no chords in my memory. I had never met or heard of this man in my life. My parents had died when I was young, and I was raised in an orphanage. I was alone in the world, or so I thought. My brow furrowed, and I could feel the wheels in my head starting to churn, sparking to life like a rusty old engine. Surely this was a mistake, a clerical error, maybe even a scam. I called the law firm immediately, my voice wavering with a strange cocktail of anxiety and curiosity. After confirming my identity, the firm reassured me that the information was accurate. I was the sole inheritor of the Wolfe estate. My mind was in a whirlwind. One minute I was buried under a mountain of bills in my cramped apartment, and the next I was the owner of a mansion. A mansion. It seemed absurd, dreamlike, and yet there it was in black and white. The prospect was tempting. The allure of an escape from my monotonous life, the idea of a fresh start. I couldn't deny the attraction. I remember looking around my apartment, the bare walls staring back at me with a cold indifference. My gaze fell on the stack of overdue bills, the constant reminder of my financial struggle. I felt a sudden wave of defiance. Maybe this was my chance, my opportunity to turn a new page, to redefine my narrative. With a determined sigh, I made my decision. In hindsight, the gravest mistake of my life. I packed my essentials, submitted my indefinite leave application, and booked a one-way ticket to Ireland. Mixed emotions filled me as I studied the pictures attached to the letter. The mansion that now supposedly belonged to me was a stately, antiquated behemoth. Ivy crept up its gray stone walls, adorning the large Gothic windows. The images captured an eerie beauty of the place, a sense of isolated grandeur that appealed to me. It was a world away from my shoebox apartment in London, a tantalizing vision of an alternate life that was now within my grasp. It was an opportunity, I thought, to finally turn the tables on my mounting debts and relentless financial struggles. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. As I learned from the letter, the man who had left me this inheritance was my uncle, a brother to my mother, who had departed from this world long before I was old enough to know her. I found myself mourning a man I never knew, and a family connection I had long been ignorant of. My uncle was apparently a collector, a connoisseur of rare things, filling his mansion with a treasure trove of artifacts and curiosities. The thought of inheriting not just a house, but a collection of potentially valuable items had my heart racing. The thrill of this unexpected fortune was in stark contrast to the dull rhythm of my life. An inheritance could be my lifeline, my escape from the relentless clutch of financial difficulties. I couldn't help but smile, a genuine smile, one that hadn't graced my face in a long while. Jackpot, I thought to myself, my heart heavy with a sudden surge of hope. For once it felt like Lady Luck was finally shining her radiant smile on me. My reasons for accepting this inheritance weren't entirely materialistic. There was a burgeoning curiosity within me, a desire to learn about this family I never knew I had. This was a part of my history, a piece of the puzzle that was my past, and it was calling to me. Still, there was an air of mystery shrouding it all. Why would my uncle, whom I'd never met or spoken to, leave his entire estate to me? And why was I only finding out about him now? These were questions that needed answers. Answers I hoped I would find in the grand halls of my newly acquired mansion. My journey from a mundane existence to the unexpected inheritance of an ancestral mansion felt like a thrilling novel. As my plane cut through the sky, I had no idea that I was heading into a web of mysteries and horrors, dark and twisted, that were lying in wait for me. While I was eager to get to the mansion, I was unaware of the chilling turn my life was about to take. It was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, but not in the way I had hoped. The plane journey was followed by a long drive through dense forests and winding roads. The village, a small settlement shrouded in a thick, unyielding mist, lay a few miles away from the homestead. It was as if the clouds had descended, blanketing the world in a hazy white mantle. The path was scarcely traveled, reinforcing a sense of isolation that tickled at the back of my mind. But I shook off the unease, reminding myself that this was a part of my new adventure. I decided to make a stop at a local inn to gather some information about my inheritance and get a more precise direction to the mansion. As I walked in, the rustic charm of the place did little to ease the curious glances that met me. Eyes shifted uncomfortably, conversations quieted, and an unsettling silence swept over the room as the locals turned to regard the stranger who'd just entered their domain. The innkeeper, a burly man with grizzled hair and a weather-beaten face, eyed me suspiciously. His eyes held a curious mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Wariness, perhaps? Mustering a smile, I approached him, trying to sound as amiable as possible. "Hello, sir. I'm Harry. I just got into town. I was hoping you might help me find my way to the old Wolf estate." The moment I mentioned the mansion, the innkeeper's eyes widened, and a palpable tension fell over the room. The whispers from the corner tables ceased. The villagers exchanged nervous glances as if my words had somehow disturbed the very air. The innkeeper leaned back, studying me more carefully this time. "You've got business with the Wolf estate?" he asked, a shadow of unease creeping into his voice. "Yes," I responded, my curiosity piqued by their reactions. "Actually, I've inherited the estate. I'm Archibald Wolf's nephew." Upon hearing this, a man seated at the bar counter, who had been nursing his beer all this while, suddenly looked up. His face turned a shade of white, and his eyes bore into me with a bitterness I couldn't comprehend. "You ought to leave, lad," he spat, his voice low but clear in the silent room. "Go back to wherever you came from, and never return." My eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "But why?" I tried to ask, only to be interrupted by the man's raised hand. "Don't ask questions. Just leave," he said, turning his gaze back to his drink, his lips curling into a hardened frown. Disappointment, and a certain amount of unease, settled in my stomach. Their reaction, their clear aversion to even talking about the estate, was unnerving. But by then, I'd already gleaned enough information to make my way to the mansion. Leaving the inn, I could feel their eyes on me, a heavy and foreboding presence that lingered long after I'd gotten back into my car. A knot of worry twisted in my gut, but I shook off the feeling. This was my inheritance, my chance at a new life, and I wasn't going to let the superstitious fears of the villagers stop me. So I started my car, leaving the mistrustful stares of the villagers behind, driving off into the unknown. The winding path leading to the mansion twisted and turned through a dense, gnarled forest, where overgrown trees leaned ominously over the trail. The wind whistled through the branches, a haunting symphony that added to the mounting sense of anxiety. The secluded mansion slowly revealed itself, a monolithic structure shrouded in a gossamer veil of mist that added a spectral quality to its already foreboding facade. Gothic towers rose into the gloomy sky. Carved gables peered down at me, their stone faces weathered by time. It was as if the mansion itself was observing my arrival, watching me with a quiet, eerie intent. I swallowed hard, tamping down the unease that knotted in my gut. With a deep breath, I pushed the heavy wooden door open, and the mansion welcomed me with a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the rustling echo of my footsteps. The air smelled musty, ancient, and untouched, like the pages of a long-forgotten book. Determined, I began my exploration. The rooms were frozen in time, a tribute to a bygone era. Antique furniture occupied the spaces, bearing the intricate craftsmanship of the centuries. Priceless curios and trinkets filled the shelves, a testament to my uncle's peculiar tastes. As I walked deeper into the mansion, I discovered that some of the doors were locked. This, of course, ignited my curiosity. My eyes scanned the surroundings, eventually landing on a dusty old key lying on an oak desk. I picked it up, feeling the weight of its cold metal against my palm. A strange thrill of anticipation ran through me as I approached the nearest locked door. I slid the key into the keyhole. It fit perfectly. As I slowly turned it, an ominous creak echoed through the eerie silence, the sound like a whispered warning. Ignoring the chill running down my spine, I pushed the door open. It reluctantly gave way, revealing a dark corridor bathed in shadows. As I ventured into the hallway, the dim light from the open door behind me revealed the outlines of ancient portraits hanging on the walls. The portraits depicted men and women in outdated attire, their stern faces seemingly locked in a perpetual state of judgment. Their eyes were painted to appear motionless, yet I couldn't shake off the feeling that their gazes were tracking my every move. One portrait in particular caught my attention. It was a painting of a young girl whose eyes mirrored my own. Beside her were painted several other people, their faces blurred with time. My heart raced as I realized the girl in the painting was my mother, my secretive yet loving mother. It was a face I hadn't seen in years, yet it was unmistakably hers. She'd always been vague about her past, only mentioning that she was from Ireland. But seeing her immortalized on the mansion's wall, it became clear that her lineage was older and far more complex than she had ever admitted. I was not only upset, but also intrigued. Why would she hide such an important part of our history? I ventured further down the hallway, each step stirring the dust that lay in a thick layer on the hardwood floors. One particular door seemed to call to me, its wood aged and its handle cold to touch. With an uncertain hand, I pushed it open, revealing a forgotten room with dust-covered furniture and scattered papers. Flipping through the pages, I found records of our family tree and the fact that our ancestors were somehow connected to the ancient kingdom of Osreg. My uncle must have done some research, I decided. I also came across records of some kind of curse associated with the ancient kingdom and its inhabitants. The diary spoke of the irrevocability of retribution for unholy deeds. One passage caught my attention. It read, "It is said that when St. Patricius, St. Patrick, preached Christianity in that land, there was one clan that opposed him more stubbornly than any other. These people sought in every way to offend both God and the saint. And when he preached the faith to them, as he did to others, and came to speak to them where they held their meetings, they decided to howl at him like wolves. Further into the diary, there were strange, unsettling sketches of animals with fur and grotesque heads. As I flipped through the pages, an animal howl echoed from outside the window. The sound was so unexpected and so close that I nearly dropped the diary. Goosebumps crawled over my skin, a cold shiver running down my spine. I was frightened, and despite my curiosity, I had to admit that I was overwhelmed. Deciding I'd had enough for one night, I decided to call it a day. I closed the journal and the door to my room, promising myself to return in the morning when the sunlight would make the past less frightening. For now, I needed to find a quiet corner of the massive, creepy mansion and try to sleep. As darkness took hold, a thunderstorm ensued. The wind howled like a wounded beast, its eerie song mingling with the booming thunder and the relentless drumming of rain against the mansion's cold stone walls. Inside, I lay shivering in the living room, the blanket pulled tight around me, the chill seeping into my bones, and the silence feeling heavier with each passing moment. The wind outside, the cryptic messages in my uncle's diary, the cold, stern faces looking down from the paintings, the villagers' apprehension, and the looming manor. Everything left an unsettling imprint on my heart. Sleep eluded me as thoughts twisted and turned like specters in my mind. A seed of doubt had begun to take root, its tendrils snaking around my thoughts. What if the inheritance wasn't as benign as it seemed? What if my uncle had left me this house with some ulterior motive in mind? But what could that be? A sudden crash in the distance made me start, breaking the rhythmic cadence of the storm outside. Fear prickled at the base of my neck. It was coming from one of the far rooms. I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. But the idea of cowering in the living room didn't sit well with me. I grabbed a flashlight, its beam dancing eerily on the mansion's old stone walls as I walked towards the source of the noise. With caution, I pushed open the door to find a shattered window, the frames clapping wildly against the wall under the force of the wind. Glass shards glittered ominously on the floor. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside and maneuvered my way towards the window. With a bit of struggle and a heavy book to hold it in place, I managed to shut it, blocking out the tempestuous wind. Just as I was beginning to relax, another noise pierced the storm's symphony. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the floor above. A chill coursed down my spine, my blood turning to ice in my veins. I was alone in this massive mansion, trapped between the raging storm outside and the echoing footsteps from within. Could it be burglars? Or perhaps a wild animal seeking refuge from the storm? Or something more ominous? Fear twisted in my stomach, but I clung to the flashlight, my only source of light and comfort. Steeling myself, I decided to check out the living room and lock all the doors leading to the upper floors. If it was just a nocturnal animal or a stray gust of wind, I could lock myself safely and wait out the storm. My fingers were numb around the handle of the flashlight as I began to move down the hallway, each step resonating in the eerie silence of the mansion. Suddenly, I heard a screech that sounded like the screaming of 1,000 damned souls, echoing throughout the mansion. It was a door, its hinges groaning as it swung open. My heart pounded in my chest, matching the rhythm of the thunder outside. Slowly, with a sense of impending doom, I turned around. Out from the darkness of the room, a monstrous figure emerged. Its body was shrouded in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with an inhuman light. Terror seized me, and a primal instinct to survive took over. I bolted, adrenaline fueling my steps. I sprinted into the living room, but to my horror, another shaggy creature lurked there. It snarled, its eyes glowing ominously as it noticed my presence. I froze, trapped between the two monstrous figures. The only thing I could think of was to grab the closest thing to me, a heavy glass vase, and hurl it at the beast in the living room. It roared in anger and flinched, momentarily distracted. Seizing the opportunity, I dashed for the staircase, the gnarled creatures hot on my heels. The old wooden stairs creaked and groaned under my weight, each step a terrifying beat in the symphony of my flight. I could hear their heavy breaths, almost feel their presence closing in on me. My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled into one of the rooms, slamming the door shut behind me. Leaning against it, I strained to listen. The only sound was the thundering of my heart and the storm outside. I had escaped, but only by a hair's breadth. Rapidly, I barricaded the entrance. I used everything I could find. Chairs, a heavy table from the adjacent room, anything that could possibly hold the creatures at bay. As I secured the last piece of furniture against the doors, I slid down to the floor, exhaustion seeping into my bones. A feeling of helplessness descended upon me, a shroud as heavy as the darkness around me. The light from the flashlight trembled in my hand, illuminating the unknown corners of the room. My heart pounded with a fear I had never known before, each beat screaming a silent prayer that the beasts wouldn't find me. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of doors being shattered, the creatures' guttural growls echoing through the mansion. They were coming. I held my breath, my heart pounding louder than the storm outside. The monsters prowled through the rooms, their footsteps an ominous tattoo on the wooden floor. I heard one approach the door, its grunts growing louder. The door rattled under its monstrous strength. One knock, then another. My heart mirrored the dreadful rhythm, pulsing in sync with every hit. With each impact, the door seemed to bow under the weight of the creature. Any moment now, and it would give way, leaving me at the mercy of the monstrous creature. And then, cutting through the dread, a high-pitched whistle pierced the air. It was deafening, filling every crevice of the mansion with its shrill sound. The pain was so intense that I clamped my hands over my ears, the flashlight dropping onto the floor. But the whistle continued to blare, drowning out every other sound. The deafening whistle continued to reverberate in the air, filling the room with its terrifying pitch. My head pounded in agony as I sank to the floor, the pain making the room spin around me. But then, I noticed the silence. The battering against the iron door had ceased. The growls, the howls, everything had quieted down. With a sense of disbelief, I moved towards the door, placing my ear against the cold iron. I strained to hear anything that could signal the presence of the beasts, but all I could hear was the shrill echo of the whistle. I felt a slight surge of hope. I slowly made my way towards the room's single window. The storm outside was lessening now, the thunder a distant rumble. And then I saw him, a solitary figure standing amidst the trees. He was holding a whistle to his lips, its metallic gleam catching the occasional flashes of the storm. I watched in awe as he blew into it again. The pain was immediate, sharp and blinding. I clutched my ears, wincing at the intensity of the sound. But as I opened my eyes, I saw something even more unbelievable. The monsters were coming out of the mansion. They looked like wolves, their shaggy fur dripping wet from the rain. One by one, they sprinted into the woods, their lupine figures disappearing among the trees. The man stood firm, the whistle still in his hand, watching the beasts retreat. They did not attack him. did not even come close to him, as though he commanded an unseen authority over them. And then he looked up, his gaze piercing through the stormy night and directly into the room where I was hiding. I froze, fear momentarily locking me in place. The man stood there for a moment longer before he turned around, disappearing into the woods just as the first rays of the morning sun began to illuminate the horizon. Exhausted, scared, and most importantly, alive, I gathered my belongings and fled the mansion. I didn't give a second glance at the looming manor, the inheritance, or the village. My rented car seemed like a safe haven, a refuge from the horrors of the night. I revved up the engine, the homestead disappearing in my rearview mirror. I had one thing in my mind: home. The inheritance, the village, the mansion. They had all faded away, becoming mere specters of a nightmare I wished to forget. I was heading home, away from the eerie whistle, away from the monstrous beasts, away from the haunting memory of a man in the woods. I wanted to forget everything like a bad dream.